You were never supposed to hear this. Buried in the vaults of Washington, hidden under red ink and locked doors, was a single sentence that could shake nations. Deliver 60% of your oil and gold, or face consequences. It wasn't written by a diplomat. It wasn't signed by a banker. It carried the mark of a man who treated the world like a casino, Donald J. Trump, then President of the United States. This wasn't diplomacy. It was extortion, sharpened into policy, delivered not with words of peace, but with the blade of empire. They didn't call it theft. They dressed it in polished language, stamped it with strategic resource acquisition framework. But make no mistake, it was a demand for chains, a contract for slavery wearing a suit and tie. And on the other side of that ultimatum sat a soldier. Captain Ibrahim Traore, the young leader of Burkina Faso, stared down the letter in silence. He knew the weight of history. Libya burned, Iraq shattered, nations stripped bare. Every page dripped with the arrogance of power. Hand it over, or we will break you. But what Trump didn't expect, what none of the oil men, the generals, the silent bankers expected, was a refusal. A line in the sand. A single act of defiance that would ignite not just a nation, but an entire continent. Because when Traore lifted his head from that letter, he didn't see a deal. He saw a declaration of war. Understand this. When empires want your blood, they never knock politely. They arrive cloaked as allies, carrying contracts, cameras, and promises. But behind their words are knives. Behind their smiles are chains. And for centuries, Africa has known this theater well, first with crosses, then with rifles, then with banks. Always extraction, always control. Trump's ultimatum wasn't unique. It was tradition. A continuation of the same parasite logic that carved borders with steel, drained gold into European vaults, and left nations starving beside their own abundance. For Washington, the playbook is old. Demand, destabilize, devour. But here was the fracture. Here was the break in the script. Traore didn't beg. He didn't stall. He summoned his intelligence chief and military commander, looked them in the eyes, and said, "Tell the Americans Burkina Faso is not for sale." That sentence, calm, simple, and immovable, was more dangerous than any weapon, because it carried an ancient memory, the memory of men who bled for sovereignty, of women who buried children stolen by empire, of soil that has drunk enough of foreign greed. In that moment, Traore wasn't just a soldier. He became the echo of resistance. And Washington understood instantly. If one nation breaks free, others will follow. Mali, Niger, Congo, Chad. The idea was more lethal than gold, more volatile than oil. The idea of Africa saying no. That is why the cables carried threats. That is why the satellites locked their eyes on the Sahel. Because they knew the truth. A single refusal can unravel an entire empire. Beneath the dry plains of northern Burkina Faso, something vast and forbidden was stirring. For years, whispers spoke of untapped veins of gold, of black rivers of oil running beneath the sand. The West dismissed it as rumor, the chatter of dreamers. But Traore knew the truth. He had seen the classified scans, guarded by soldiers who would rather die than leak them. Russian engineers had confirmed it. Iranian drones had mapped it. North Korean technicians had encrypted the data so tightly even the CIA couldn't crack it. Beneath the dust lay billions, wealth enough to unshackle a nation from the IMF, enough to build an Africa that no longer knelt. But satellites never sleep. The instant the drills pierced Earth, the vultures overhead took notice. American eyes, French eyes, endless orbits of surveillance that traced every shipment, every encrypted message, every convoy slipping across borders in the dead of night. Within days, the alarms went off in Washington and Paris. Burkina Faso was not waiting for permission. They were already taking back their resources. French mining firms were being pushed out, replaced not with Wall Street contractors, but with national soldiers. Gold revenues stopped flowing to Paris and began pouring into local development funds. The system of plunder, unbroken for centuries, was cracking. That's why Trump's demand was so ruthless, so urgent. It wasn't just about oil or gold. It was about strangling an idea before it could spread. Because nothing terrifies an empire more than a colony, remembering it was never meant to bow. The letter was read, twice, then set aside like a piece of trash unworthy of fear. Traore rose from his chair, eyes locked not on the paper, but on the men in the room. His words were sharp, stripped of hesitation. So that is their price for peace. Slavery in a suit and tie. Then they will get our resistance instead. Within hours, orders thundered through Burkina Faso's chain of command. Oil fields secured. Gold convoys doubled in protection. Data lines severed from foreign contractors. A nation pulling its arteries away from the machine that had fed on it for decades. And then, the announcement. No polished stage, no diplomatic smiles. Just a soldier in uniform, one hand on the Burkinabe flag, the other gripping a folder marked confidential. U.S. threat. His voice carried the weight of centuries. To the people of Burkina Faso and to our African brothers and sisters, an offer has been made to sell our oil, our gold, and our honor in exchange for fear. To those behind this insult, Mr. Trump and his backers, you have misjudged us. We are not Libya. We are not Iraq. We are not your playground. You gave us 48 hours. Here is our answer. You now have 48 hours to leave African soil. The silence that followed wasn't weakness. It was thunder waiting to break. And when it did, Africa erupted. Streets lit with cheers. Radios roared with defiance. Headlines blazed across the continent. For the first time in decades, a leader had stared the empire in the eye and said a word it wasn't built to hear. No, the West does not forgive disobedience. Within hours of Traore's broadcast, the machine roared awake. Not soldiers at first, never soldiers. The empire knows how to bleed a nation without firing a shot. Screens lit up with headlines crafted in the same boardrooms that wrote the ultimatum. Burkina Faso risks humanitarian collapse. Traore unstable, erratic, unfit to lead. Social media flooded with sudden smear campaigns, fake scandals, and whispers of madness. CIA drones circled tighter over the Sahel, while private contractors, mercenaries wearing no flags, were spotted along the Ghana border. This wasn't about facts. It was about control. Manufacture fear, fracture trust, make the people doubt the man who dared to resist. That has always been the formula. Destroy the image, then destroy the body. But something unexpected happened. Inside Burkina Faso, the opposite unfolded. The harder the media pushed the narrative of collapse, the more the people rallied. University students held underground teachings on sovereignty. Women's groups brought food to soldiers guarding gold mines. Young men laughed at CNN's expert panels and reposted them with one line. If they hate him this much, he must be doing something right. The empire's weapon had always been psychological domination, convincing nations they were powerless, making men believe they had no choice but to kneel. But Traore had shattered that script. His defiance planted something the West could not bomb or sanction out of existence: belief. And belief spreads like fire. Once lit, it does not return to silence. Defiance is powerful alone, but united, it becomes unstoppable. Just days after Traore's rejection of Trump's ultimatum, 3 planes touched down in Ouagadougou. No diplomats, no Western handlers, no staged smiles. These were not men of suits. They were men of war. From Mali came Colonel Assimi Goïta, steady and silent. From Niger, General Abdourahmane Chiani, eyes burning with fire. From Guinea, Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, towering, unapologetic. They walked into the presidential palace without hesitation, without cameras, without fear. And when they emerged, they stood shoulder to shoulder beside Traore. Then came the line that rippled across the continent. If you touch Burkina Faso, you touch all of us. It wasn't a speech. It was a declaration. A doctrine forged not in treaties, but in blood, betrayal, and the dream of a continent no longer ruled by outside masters. They called it the AES Shield, Africa's answer to NATO. Mali pledged hardened advisors to guard oil fields. Niger mobilized logistics teams through the desert terrain. Guinea opened its skies for supply runs. And it wasn't just military. Online, AES-backed media unleashed a counterattack. flooding social feeds with a single mantra: our resources, our future, our fight. Murals went up in Conakry. Chants thundered through Bamako. Youth in Chad and Central Africa rallied in the streets. AES or death. For the first time in generations, Africa was not begging, not waiting. It was building a firewall against empire. And in Washington, fear turned into panic, because they knew unity is the one weapon they cannot kill. When the empire trembles, new players move in. They don't come with ultimatums. They don't arrive with threats disguised as deals. They arrive with tools, with leverage, with the unspoken message: you are not alone. 72 hours after Trump's deadline, a quiet Chinese delegation landed in Ouagadougou. No cameras, no speeches, just engineers, economists, and one stunning proposal: an oil refinery, fully built in 90 days. Gold valuation systems that cut Western banks out completely. A digital trade network powered by the yuan, bypassing both the CFA franc and the dollar. For the first time, Burkina Faso could own not just its resources, but every link of the value chain. The very next day, a Russian Ilyushin cargo jet touched down on a secured strip. Inside, advanced electronic warfare gear, anti-drone systems, and crates marked only as specialized defense assets. Translation: Burkina Faso's oil fields would no longer be naked under Western satellites. Washington called it dangerous. CNN screamed dictatorships expanding, but on the ground in Africa, no one cared what Western anchors thought. To them, China and Russia weren't saviors. They were instruments, and Traore was the hand that wielded them. But here's where I need you, watching this now. If you understand what this moment means, not just for Burkina Faso, but for every man who refuses to kneel, write this phrase in the comments twice to lock it into your identity. We protect what's ours. Because that is the oath the empire fears most, and once spoken, it changes you. When Washington panics, it does not show weakness, it shows teeth. Within days of the AES alliance and the arrival of Russian and Chinese support, the West unleashed its full-spectrum war. The IMF froze emergency loans. The EU slammed sanctions on gold exports. Visa systems cut Burkinabe banks off from global transfers. Overnight, the empire tried to choke a nation into submission. And yet, the real strike wasn't economic, it was psychological. Documentaries suddenly appeared on Netflix and BBC, The Dictator Next Door. Paid think tanks released research papers warning of regional instability. Social media bots pushed hashtags like #traore the tyrant in English, French, and Arabic. Every channel, every feed, every outlet screamed the same command: do not admire him, do not follow him, do not believe him. But the effect was the opposite. In Mali, murals of Traore spread across entire neighborhoods. In Niger, youth blasted his speeches from motorbikes like war anthems. In Ghana and Senegal, student unions staged sit-ins waving signs that read, "Your sanctions cannot sanction our spirit." Even in the West, cracks began to show. African diasporas marched in Paris and New York, chanting his name, burning dollar bills in defiance. TikTok clips of Traore's rejection of Trump's letter went viral, amassing millions of views. Uncensored, unstoppable, beyond the control of gatekeepers. Because when you try to bury a man with lies, but his truth matches the hunger of a people, you don't bury him, you plant him. And the empire had just planted a forest it could no longer cut down. When propaganda collapses, when sanctions fail, when fear no longer works, there is only one card left: assassination. Whispers of plots bled into Ouagadougou's night air. A French intelligence team seen slipping across the Ivorian border. CIA-linked contractors suddenly embedded with NGOs. Anonymous tips of poison shipments bound for the presidential kitchens. The empire had moved past patience. Now it wanted Traore's body in the ground. But he was not naive. His security detail tripled. Russian counterintelligence units wired his compound with jammers. Even meals were sealed and tested before reaching his table. Every visitor was scanned, every convoy shadowed. He lived like a man inside a battlefield, because he was. Then came the breach. An explosion ripped through a Burkinabe army outpost near Kaya, blamed instantly on terrorist insurgents. But forensic teams discovered NATO-grade explosives, devices no desert militia could acquire. Someone, somewhere, had paid for mercenaries to masquerade as jihadists, destabilizing the region and framing Traore's government as incompetent. The message was clear: we will bleed your country until your people beg for your removal. But instead of cracking, Burkina Faso hardened. Volunteers poured into recruitment offices. Mothers sent sons with prayers and rifles. Songs of resistance echoed through the capital. If he falls, we all fall. If he stands, we all rise. And somewhere in Washington, a truth dawned like a nightmare. Every bullet aimed at Traore only made him larger. Every attempt to kill him made his image immortal. Because when a man becomes an idea, you cannot assassinate him. You can only accelerate him. When assassinations fail, empires escalate. They do not retreat. They double down, sharpening every weapon of hybrid war, economic, digital, military, cultural, unleashed all at once like a swarm. Burkina Faso's power grid flickered, then collapsed. Not from drought, not from faulty wires, but from precision cyber attacks traced to IPs in Virginia and Brussels. Bank accounts of Burkinabe officials were mysteriously frozen in Dubai. Oil shipments bound for China were sabotaged at sea by pirates wielding NATO-grade rifles. And then came the proxies. Militias long dormant in Mali and Niger suddenly rearmed, moving in convoys that intelligence satellites mysteriously missed. Jihadist cells funded by unknown donors began targeting AES convoys, perfectly timed to media headlines painting Traore as unable to guarantee security. It was a siege without borders, a war without declaration. And yet, in the halls of Western power, they called it restoring stability. But Traore was not alone anymore. AES forces mobilized in unison. Malian drones swept the Sahel skies. Nigerian artillery fortified trade routes. Guinea's naval units shadowed cargo shipments in the Gulf. And for the first time, African cyber units, trained quietly by Russian and Iranian specialists, fought back in the digital shadows, exposing Western sabotage in real time. Then came the phrase that rattled Washington: touch one, touch all. Broadcast on African television, plastered across social feeds, painted on city walls from Bamako to Conakry. No longer just a slogan, it was now a shield. For centuries, empire thrived on division, on turning neighbor against neighbor. But now, for the first time, Africa was moving as one body. And the empire, in all its arrogance, had birthed the very monster it feared most: unity armed with belief. By now, whispers had become roars. Western think tanks stopped pretending. Policy papers openly called for direct intervention to secure African resources and stabilize the region. French generals dusted off contingency plans from the colonial era. In Washington, Pentagon briefings spoke coldly of limited strikes and surgical pressure campaigns. It was no longer about Burkina Faso. It was about fear, the empire's deepest fear, that one nation's defiance could spread like wildfire across the continent, burning centuries of control to ash. Satellite images confirmed it. U.S. Special Forces massing in Ghana, French paratroopers redeployed to Ivory Coast, drones circling like vultures over the Sahel. The message was clear: prepare for invasion dressed as humanitarian intervention. But Africa was not silent. Across the AES states, soldiers drilled side by side. Columns of Burkinabe and Malian troops marched through Ouagadougou, cheered by crowds chanting, "We protect what's ours." Nigerian engineers hardened desert fortifications, while Guinean jets carved the skies in defiance. Then came the broadcast that split the world in two. Traore, flanked by Goita, Chiani, and Doumbouya, looked directly into the cameras. His words were measured, unshaken. If a single Western soldier steps onto our soil under the name of intervention, understand this clearly: it will no longer be Burkina Faso. It will no longer be Mali, or Niger, or Guinea. It will be Africa. And Africa will meet you as one. The footage ricocheted across the globe. In African capitals, it was thunder. In Western war rooms, it was terror. Because they knew the truth. This was no longer a regional rebellion. This was the birth of a continental line in the sand. And once drawn, such lines can only be crossed at the cost of empire itself. The Sahel had become the world's fault line. Every hour, the line between shadow war and open conflict thinned. Proxy militias struck AES convoys, leaving bodies in the sand. Western media immediately blamed internal corruption. Cyber attacks blacked out entire districts of Ouagadougou for days, while satellite footage of French and U.S. bases showed convoys training just miles from Burkina Faso's borders. And then came the spark. A Burkinabe patrol intercepted a column of insurgents near the Nigerian frontier. But these were no desert raiders. Their weapons were stamped with NATO serial codes, their comms traced to encrypted Western satellites. The clash was brief but brutal. Dozens of mercenaries dead, some captured alive. Under interrogation, they confessed. They were contractors hired out of Poland and the Balkans, funneled through a French base in Abidjan. The footage went public. Africa erupted. Across the continent, crowds flooded the streets screaming one word: invasion. From Dakar to Kinshasa, diaspora youth torched French flags, stormed Western embassies, and broadcast their rage online. The illusion of stability operations was shattered. The West denied everything. The White House called the claims fabrications. Paris fumbled, insisting the mercenaries were rogue actors, but the truth had already burned through the lies. EES leaders convened an emergency summit in Bamako. Cameras caught the moment Traore slammed his fist onto the table and declared, "They have crossed the line. From this moment on, our struggle is no longer defense. It is liberation." The room erupted. Mali pledged fighters. Niger pledged missiles. Guinea pledged its navy. And for the first time since colonialism carved it apart, Africa began to speak not as fragments, but as a single force with a single enemy. The world held its breath, because everyone knew what came next. The age of quiet exploitation was dead. The age of confrontation had begun. The first clash came at dawn. On the border near Fada Ngorma, Burkinabe scouts detected drones circling above, American MQ-9 Reapers. Hours later, explosions ripped through an AES supply convoy. Washington called it a counter-terrorism strike, but the dead were Burkinabe engineers, not militants. Within minutes, Traore gave the order, "Strike back." Malian drones lifted off desert runways, Nigerian artillery thundered from concealed batteries, and Guinean jets swept low across the skies. For the first time in history, African forces directly targeted Western assets. A French forward operating base in northern Ivory Coast was hit with precision strikes. Fuel depots engulfed in flames, satellite images of the blaze spreading like wildfire online. Paris panicked. Washington raged. But the people of Africa roared. Cities erupted in celebration. Fireworks in Bamako. Chants in Ouagadougou. Africa fights back. Then came the escalation. U.S. Marines were spotted moving toward Ghana's northern frontier. French paratroopers redeployed to secure Niger's uranium mines. Western news anchors began rehearsing the same line. Regional instability demands humanitarian intervention. But Africa no longer believed their script. The AES broadcasted its own footage, burning Western bases, captured mercenaries confessing, columns of African soldiers marching under a single banner. For the first time, the narrative was not controlled in New York, Paris, or London. It was controlled in Africa. And behind the curtain, a larger storm gathered. China announced it would guarantee AES oil purchases, sanctions or not. Russia declared that any attack on our African allies will be considered an attack on us. The battlefield had shifted. What began as an ultimatum in Trump's letter had now spiraled into a global confrontation. The empire had fired its first shots, and Africa had answered. The fire spread faster than the empire expected. What they thought would be a contained security operation ignited into a continental war. In Niger, AES forces stormed French-controlled uranium sites. expelling foreign staff and raising their own flags. In Mali, Western convoys were ambushed in the desert, leaving charred wreckage scattered across dunes that had once swallowed colonial caravans. In Guinea, naval patrols intercepted a European tanker attempting to smuggle crude under forged contracts. Its capture broadcast live on state television as crowds cheered in the ports. But the war was not just on land. The skies became battlegrounds. AES drones, once dismissed as crude toys, began swarming Western aircraft with shocking effectiveness. Footage of a French Mirage jet spiraling into the Sahel went viral, captioned simply, "Africa shoots back." The empire retaliated with overwhelming force. Cruise missiles struck Ouagadougou's outskirts. A U.S. cyber strike shut down AES communications for 12 hours. Western media plastered screens with images of burning villages, blaming Traore and the Alliance for chaos. And yet, the opposite happened. The more they struck, the more Africa hardened. Refugees were sheltered by neighbors instead of abandoned. Farmers took up arms beside soldiers. Songs of defiance turned into war chants. If one falls, 1,000 rise. Then came the shock that rattled every capital on Earth. AES forces captured a major Western base in northern Niger, complete with weapons, servers, and classified documents. Within hours, AES media leaked proof that Western governments had been funding insurgent groups for over a decade to justify their presence in Africa. The scandal detonated online. Hashtags surged worldwide. #Africa Unchained and #Empire Exposed. For the first time, even Western citizens began questioning their leaders. The Empire had thrown its armies, its lies, its technology at Africa. And yet, Africa was not breaking. It was breaking free. By now, the war was no longer just Africa's. It had become the world's fault line, the line between empire and the multipolar future. In Brussels, NATO convened an emergency summit. Generals demanded a rapid intervention force to crush the AES alliance before it spread. Politicians, terrified of losing Africa's minerals, spoke of a new Marshall Plan, but their words were drowned out by the drums of war. Behind closed doors, invasion maps were already being drawn. Washington moved faster. Carrier groups steamed toward the Gulf of Guinea. U.S. drones filled West African skies. In Congress, leaders declared that the stability of Africa is a core American interest. But everyone knew the translation. The dollar cannot survive without Africa's gold, oil, and uranium. And yet, the empire's threats no longer echoed unchallenged. Moscow announced it had stationed military advisors in Ouagadougou and Bamako, thinly veiled code for special forces. Beijing declared that any disruption of African trade routes would be considered an attack on China's economic security. Iranian warships appeared in the Gulf, shadowing Western fleets. The world had split into two camps, one clinging desperately to centuries of control, the other rising, raw and untested, but united by a single word: sovereignty. In Africa itself, the people transformed. Farmers became soldiers. Students became code breakers. Markets ran on barter when the dollar was cut off. And every strike from the empire only forged more unity. Then came the broadcast that froze the world in silence. From a bunker deep beneath Ouagadougou, Traore spoke with a calm fire in his eyes. For 500 years, Africa bled for others. That era is finished. If they come with war, they will find not slaves, not servants, but nations unchained. We will not return to the yoke. Not now. Not ever. The transmission was watched by billions. In the streets of Lagos, Johannesburg, and Nairobi, people cheered as if borders no longer existed. In Paris and Washington, leaders sat pale, realizing what had slipped from their hands. Because this was no longer just a regional rebellion. It was the trigger of a new world order. It began with a roar over the Gulf of Guinea. An AES cargo ship carrying Guinean bauxite bound for China was shadowed by a French frigate. The order came from Paris: seize it. But the Guinean navy did not bow. A brief exchange turned into an inferno. Missiles fired, the French frigate crippled, its smoke rising over international waters. The West called it piracy. Africa called it defense. Within hours, NATO declared the formation of a coalition task force to secure West Africa. American warplanes redeployed from Europe, French paratroopers massed in Ivory Coast, British special forces were reported in Ghana under the cover of joint training. But the AES was ready. Burkina Faso anti-air units brought down 2 U.S. drones near Ouagadougou. Malian strike teams sabotaged French fuel depots in Abidjan. Nigerian missiles lit up the desert skies, forcing NATO aircraft to retreat from the Sahel. For the first time since independence, Africa was not cowering. It was striking back blow for blow. The battlefield expanded to cyberspace. African hackers, trained by Russian and Iranian advisors, crashed European stock indexes for hours, erasing billions. In retaliation, Western cyber units hit AES hospitals and power plants, proof that empire had no lines it would not cross. The world watched in disbelief. Commentators who once dismissed Traore as a radical populist now called him the man who broke the empire's fear. In Western capitals, protests exploded, citizens refusing to send their sons to die for uranium and oil. And then came the strike that changed everything. In northern Niger, an AES missile battery locked onto a U.S. military transport plane ferrying troops from Ghana. The missile found its mark. Hundreds of American soldiers were killed in a single instant. The footage went viral before Washington could contain it. The headlines screamed, U.S. forces hit. In Africa, casualties in the hundreds. For the first time since Vietnam, the empire felt the sting of a war it could not control. And the world asked the question no leader wanted to answer. Would NATO now risk World War III to re-enslave Africa?